Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's episode in RSK series of COP15 commitment webinars from global to local, COP15 commitments, biodiversity and healthcare. Cast your mind back to December 22, when the long-awaited 15th Conference of the Parties on the Convention of Biological Diversity signed a groundbreaking commitment known as the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF, to agree to arrest the ongoing loss of global biodiversity. Agreeing to 4 overarching goals to protect biodiversity, enhance ecosystems, bring the value of biodiversity into focus, supporting sustainable development, and ensure adequate means, be they financial or technical resource, is provided to halt the decline of global biodiversity. But what does this mean in practice, and how can these global concepts be translated into local action? Go back further by another year, and the then Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Sajid Javid, wrote an open letter to all NHS Trust chief execs in November 21 during COP26, where world leaders came together in Glasgow to try and agree on how to tackle global climate crisis, stating that negotiations should not forget the global biodiversity crisis, reiterating the requirements for Trust to set out actions on biodiversity within their green plans, highlighting the positive effect on health outcomes from enhancement and access to green space, and reiterating the requirements of the newly established Environment Act, paving the way for environmental covenants and concepts such as biodiversity net gain, which we're seeing now through secondary legislation. In today's session, you'll hear from a diverse and knowledgeable panel of speakers addressing the issues within the UK health system. I'm Warren Percival, RSK Group's Healthcare Sector Director, and I'll be joined by 4 excellent speakers, with Ian Stenton, National Sustainability Programme Director of NHS England, Dr. Miriam Dobson, Project and Evidence Lead for Trees and Woodlands at the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, and our own directors from RSK Group's Nature Positive business, Catherine Risk, and Andrew Tempany from our Stevens and Halliday business unit. Format today is a series of short presentations on the topic and speakers' own personal view on how these global concepts are or can be addressed at a local level within the UK, with questions posed for discussion. Please raise any questions you've got in the Q&A chat function so that we can ask the panelists during the session. Our social media channels should be highlighted on the screens now. Please do use the following hashtags and like, pass, comment on our social channels. For Instagram, it's at the RSK Group. For LinkedIn, RSK Group. Facebook, RSK Group. And Twitter, at RSK Group. So last bit of housekeeping, your microphones are set to silent, but please do raise questions as said in the chat function, as we'll hold a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. We'll attempt to answer as many of your questions as can be answered within the time. Any outstanding items will be covered in post-session feedback to all delegates. And lastly, there will be a short survey at the end of the session so we can take some feedback for further development and future session ideas back to our team. Now to the panelists. Our first speaker today will be Catherine Risk. Catherine is the Operations Director at Nature Positive within RSK. She advises businesses on how to become more sustainable with a focus on nature impacts and dependencies. She helps businesses translate sustainability and nature risks into business strategies, models and processes to enable businesses to have a positive impact on nature whilst delivering for customers. Over to you, Catherine.
Hi everyone, and thanks Warren for that introduction. It's great to be here today to talk about COP15, biodiversity and its role in healthcare. So firstly, thanks for introducing me, Warren. As you said, I'm a director within Nature Positive. So Nature Positive is a sustainability consultancy, which is aptly named for this conversation. So alongside our carbon team and our sustainability strategy team, we also work with organisations and businesses to deliver against the global biodiversity framework that Warren was mentioning, and to help support businesses to really make a positive impact on nature. So nature is a really sort of complex and developing area in terms of how we all interact with it and understanding those interaction points so that we can make a positive impact. And in this conversation today, I'm going to recap some of the points from the Global Biodiversity Framework, understand their linkages into health at that local context, and also a little bit of the global context, and think about some of the opportunities that healthcare has in this space to really drive towards supporting some of those positive outcomes. So, as I say, first I'll do a quick run through of the Global Biodiversity Framework. I say quick, but then when it's got 23 targets, it does take a little bit of time. So firstly, we've got the 2050 vision, which is living in harmony with nature. Underneath this, that has 4 key goals. And then there's a 2030 mission, which is halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. So the 4 key goals include nature conservation, which really looks at the integrity and connectiveness of nature and ecosystems across the world and how we can support those, making sure that we have intact ecosystems that really provide ecosystem services for everyone. Then we have goal 2, which is around ecosystem service preservation, and this one looks at the sustainable use of nature and really understanding the value that nature provides to us through ecosystem services, both for now and in the future, and how we need to make sure that we preserve the delivery of those ecosystem services. And this is a really important one for healthcare because it really highlights the value that nature has in terms of our health and well-being, and the ability of us as humans to function effectively within the earth that we have. It's just super essential that these ecosystem services are enabled and preserved, and to make sure that we maintain our health. So then goal 3 is around access and benefit sharing, and again this one links quite closely into healthcare because it's looking at some of the monetary, financial and human uses of genetic resources, and the fair and equitable use of those across the world. So medicines would be a sort of a good example of the use of some of the key sort of plants and biodiversity across the world, and making sure that those have good access, and that we are not taking advantage of any communities where we do find particular new medicines, etc. And then the 4th goal is around finance and implementation. So this is making sure that it's actionable, that the things that we as individuals, businesses, organisations, governments can do can really take place. And I think we can all see in the carbon space as well that a lot of these things really require investment and momentum to take place. So then underneath this, we've got, as I said, 23 targets, which really range quite across lots of different topics. So it's trying to focus in on a few that are really important within this space, within this sector. So I think some that are worth highlighting are around target 3, which is the conservation target, which looks at trying to protect large parts of the planet, so they're managed for nature by 2030. So we can do this on some of the land that we own, but we can also do it by investing in nature and protecting where there are services that we really depend on. In addition, we've got target 15, which looks at large organisations, looking at assessing and disclosing on their risks and dependencies and impacts on nature across their operations and value chain. I think that's a really important one because often organisations only have sort of a direct impact in their operational footprint on potentially a small piece of land. So it's looking across all the things that we also buy, the places that we visit, etc., and the way that the customers then also, or client, patients in the case of healthcare, go home, and the things they take with them as well. So how are we best informing people that use these services? So there's a couple in there, and I won't go through them all, but it's definitely worth having a look through these different targets and seeing how they do apply in different contexts. So then, just to as a brief summary, I wanted to just quickly talk through some simple steps to delivering against the Global Biodiversity Framework. So these are very simple, and I've done that, but I'll sort of go a little bit deeper over the top. So assess material biodiversity impacts and dependencies. So this is a really important step. making sure that it's material to your business. So we could all be going after lots of different, I mean, there's 23 targets, we could all try and go after everything. And even that target 15 there, looking at those impacts and dependencies, that is a really big task just in itself. So thinking about it at this really first step and making sure that you're targeting the things that are going to really make an impact to your organisation is really important. So looking at things like the fact that healthcare, our health and prosperity often depends on biodiversity, and also a lot of, say for example in healthcare, there's a lot of materials are purchased. So how can we reuse or recycle or prevent any chemicals seeping into our habitats and ecosystems? So then the second step will be to utilise the material biodiversity impacts and dependencies that have been identified and develop some priority actions. There's some frameworks out there that can really help with some of this, such as science-based targets or TNFD, as well as other frameworks that exist that can provide some more, I suppose, basic advice. And there's also lots of experts out there who can support on really what matters to biodiversity. And then the final step will be around implementation and monitoring, and this is where actually sometimes it can be the more difficult part. But it's I suppose the crucial piece that we really need to put in place. So we all just need, I suppose, what I just wanted to come and say today is around nature is really essential to our society. So how can we as a society, especially around healthcare, invest to support it? I'll pass back to you, Warren, now.
That's great. Thanks, Catherine. We've just got a couple of minutes maybe to raise a question before we move on to Ian. It's a really good summary of that. What do you think are some of the most important actions that organisations such as the NHS trusts can take to have a positive impact on the GBF and nature more broadly? I
think there are some actions that can be done sort of relatively easily, often on sites, especially when the sites are a bit bigger, things like that we can put in place for sort of whether that's having a little area for wildflowers or whether it's creating a green wall or something of that like, and getting people out in that nature as well. So often what we talk about is not just the positive impacts of putting actual delivery in place, but also getting people out in nature, giving them education and the sort of positive influence you can have on a whole host of society that comes into contact with the NHS, because that is a really sort of great mechanism as well to use to sort of educate and inform. As I mentioned, there's also sort of around a lot of the chemicals and the things that are purchased as part of the NHS, is that sort of long supply chain can have quite a large impact on the world. And I think that's a really key piece in the biodiversity framework side of things, is making sure that we have an understanding of what those impacts are. We're looking to reduce them, and we're also looking to protect nature or invest in nature where those areas are being harmed.
Great, thanks for that input, Catherine. That's really useful. I think what we'll look to do now is get Ian on the stage, and we'll come back to you, Catherine, at the end of the session. But thanks for that. So I'd like to introduce Ian Stenton, National Sustainability Programme Manager for NHS England. Ian started as National Sustainability Programme Manager with NHS England in June 21, working to enable estates and facility staff across NHS to achieve national NHS net zero targets. And his role includes developing and promoting tools, guidance, and more generally working with Trust directly, ICSs and the regions to share and replicate best practice, both from a decarbonisation and general sustainability perspective. In addition, keen interest in the wider aspects of sustainability, including green spaces, which we're obviously covering today, climate adaptation, and has more than 10 years experience in the public sector in key sustainability roles, and having previously acted as the Greener NHS lead for Cheshire and Merseyside and head of sustainability at Liverpool University Hospitals. So Ian, with that, it's over to you.
Thanks, Ryan, that's brilliant. Right, I'll start to go through the slides. Right, so I'm going to talk about what we've been doing at the National Estates team. So, as Warren said, the National Estates team is part of NHS England, and we don't manage any of the NHS estate. We don't own any of the estate. We provide policy, strategy, and guidance to support hospitals, mental health and learning disability trusts, ambulance service, community, and primary care, so GP practices as well. So, when looking at what that people can do in their own on their own sites, we've just produced very recently some biodiversity guidance. This has been with input from many different organisations that are already working on green space, supported by Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. We've got Miriam speaking later, and Natural England as well. And the majority of the guidance provides practical things that people can look at if they're starting projects. Like Warren said as well, I was head of sustainability at Liverpool Hospitals there. And I had a fair bit of experience doing a therapies garden with complex rehab and some green space upgrades for staff. And we also worked really closely with Centre for Sustainable Healthcare on the nature recovery ranges. So pulling together my experience in projects and the experience of people across the country into these guides that we produced. So the first one is generic estates guidance. So how do you go about finding a space on your site? How do you make sure it's accessible? Do you need access to water or electricity? And what are the practicalities about getting that set up? So that's the first step that we'd ask most people to look at before you decide what to do, to look at what's available. And the estates teams will always have really good overviews of the estate on sites and know what's planned. Then look at engaging patient, staff and the community. So we talked a lot about how to link in the community with this. The NHS is really lucky that for our patients and our staff numbers, we have many interactions with local people in the community anyway. But this is starting to look at what the project you're doing, who's it suitable for. So there'll be opportunities in green space for patients that perhaps can't be shared with staff or the community. There'll be some opportunities to open up green spaces to local community as part of social prescribing or just sharing good practice and quality green spaces with communities. Next one looks at funding options. So this is obviously a big sticking point for lots of projects, and there's all different options. So NHS charities together have recently invested in a lot of projects across the country. We have funding from NHS Forest and others who help with Kickstart, and then there's generic funding that any projects can do from the Bags for Health, landfill tax, and starting to look at how the projects can be done. I think particularly as well with the NHS, most big hospital trusts will have their own charitable funds, and a lot of that will be for the benefit of patients and staff. So there's a clear link between the upgrade of green space and the better outcomes for patients and staff for people to look at. We also have recruiting volunteers. So again, the NHS is really lucky that a lot of people are happy to give up their time to support patients and staff, and looking at how they can be done with green space. So there's some really practical advice in there, because some trusts will want volunteers who come regularly. That doesn't always work with green space projects where there's perhaps less of a need over the winter, and it also doesn't work always when you have a project where you need volunteers for 2 days or 2 weeks to help to get a project started. So that's all covered in there. And then practical risk assessment, so what to consider when you start your project. So all this guide has been added onto the NHS Estates Collaboration Hub, so it's available for any NHS staff to look at. And we're also waiting to get signed off some more practical advice on how to upgrade green spaces on site, because we know there's lots of successful no-mow May programs and meadow creations and orchards and food growing, and also another how-to guide about how to green buildings. So that covers things like green roofs, green walls, and what to do with terraces, courtyards, and some existing space that can be upgraded really quickly. And then we'll also be hoping to get some case studies published, although Centre for Sustainable Healthcare has a lot of case studies about best practice on NHS sites. So that's the practical side of the guidance about what a GP practice or a hospital or a mental health facility can do to support staff, patients and the community. And at a national level, we've also done a how-to guide about how to work with local authorities. So we work really closely with Natural England. Our team sit on the Nature Recovery Network partnership that they host. And then Alexis Percival, who is the sustainability lead at Yorkshire Ambulance Service, she leads a national biodiversity working group for the NHS, and Natural England sit on that as well. So it's two specific things we're looking at here. One is about local nature recovery strategies. So where are the opportunities for hospitals or sub-regional groups to be a co-creator of any nature recovery strategies, or to be part of the consultation, whether that's through a formal public consultation, or there's something that's known as group consultations, where you can, I think they're called, I've written it down somewhere, landowner groups. So can the NHS work together to be a landowner group to feed into local nature recovery strategies? And then the other aspect they're working on nationally with Natural England is on biodiversity net gain. So like Warren said, that's coming in soon, and we want to make sure that where NHS big construction projects need to invest in credits, that they're done on site wherever possible or with NHS partners, and also to look at what requirement there are with other trusts. So any of the big projects, can we pull them together at a sub-regional level to make sure that the NHS benefits as much as possible, basically, because we're really good for us to get the benefits, the funding particularly, and to be able to show the outcomes from increasing biodiversity on NHS sites. So that's it for me, Warren.
Excellent. Thanks, Ian. Appreciate that. Again, we've just got a little bit of time before we move on to Miriam. In terms of the work that you've been doing and the sustainability team more broadly at a national level, what role do you think trusts or primary care sites play in helping local communities access quality green spaces? Because that's a key driver here, isn't it? The intention of going from this esoteric global requirement down to a local level.
Yeah, I think some of the case studies that we have really show that. So there's brilliant ones of food growing and allotment on primary care sites and how they've been able to link that directly into patients. We still don't currently have an overview of green spaces within NHS sites, and that will really feed in hopefully with the local nature recovery strategies, that they're looking at nature recovery networks or corridors, and how can we map NHS space so we know exactly what to focus on and where to upgrade. So that's stuff that we can do nationally, trying to work with Natural England. It's stuff that obviously makes much more sense for people in trusts or primary care to link into, because they understand the green space. And then at an ICS level, which is these sub-regional levels where we're encouraging trusts and primary care to work much closer together, they'll be starting to look at strategies for estates as well. So green space will be part of that, so they can really look at how the estate at a sub-regional level can link in with the priorities of local nature recovery partnership. So I think that's the way we do projects very locally, can look at a sub-regional level and then nationally have that overview of what the opportunities are.
Great, thanks, Ian. And perhaps we can come back to some of those concepts at the end. Please don't forget to put any questions in the chat box. So thanks, Ian. Next up on stage, or on the virtual stage, is Dr. Miriam Dobson. Miriam is the Project and Evidence Lead for Trees and Woodlands at the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. She holds a PhD in Environmental Science, and Miriam manages the NHS Forest Tree Planting Programme, working with healthcare sites to improve, expand and manage trees and woodlands for human health and wider environmental benefits. Miriam, over to you.
Thanks so much, Warren. It's really nice to be here today. So just go on to this. So the NHS Forest, as mentioned previously, is a project run by the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, which inspires and empowers sites to transform their estates for biodiversity and the health of staff, patients and the wider community. We began in 2008 as a tree donation programme, so we were donating trees to NHS sites as an engagement tool to get the healthcare sector talking about climate change. As of this year, we've now planted over 100,000 trees across the NHS, and we now focus on trees and woodlands as an end in their own right, due to the multitude of environmental and health benefits that trees and woodlands provide. And tree planting on the NHS estate can range from a single tree at a GP surgery to woodland creation projects at sites with larger areas of land available. And we also mentor and train healthcare staff in tree planting, tree and woodland management, valuing trees and woodlands, and understanding the benefits of trees. And our current work programme also involves nature recovery rangers, who are full-time staff members placed at individual healthcare sites to engage staff in nature connection activities and work on biodiversity improvements on site ground in a really place-based way. And we also work at the policy advocacy and evidence level. So we develop the evidence base for the impact of green space on health. For example, we're currently working on a project with Forest Research to value the natural capital of trees and woodlands on the NHS estate to produce sort of better bespoke evidence base and guidelines for the healthcare system to help them value their green estate. So overall, our sort of vision and mantra is that healthcare happens here. The NHS estate is valued for its role as a healthcare asset that contributes to the health not only of the human population, but also the health of our ecosystems. And it can protect and enhance biodiversity and environmental conditions, which also in turn benefit human health further. So in terms of where we see the greatest opportunities to meet the 4 goals of the COP, for the NHS Forest, our main opportunity really lies in Goal B. So Goal B of COP15 is that biodiversity is sustainably used and managed, and nature's contributions to people, including ecosystem functions and services, are valued, maintained and enhanced, with those currently in decline being restored, supporting the achievement of sustainable development for the benefit of present and future generations by 2050. The NHS estate has a huge and, until relatively recently, kind of untapped potential to enhance both biodiversity and the health benefits of nature. Although this is improving all the time as understanding of the potential impact of managing the green estate filters through at all levels of NHS decision making, as Ian said, from kind of national level strategic work right through to case studies and projects on the ground at different sorts of healthcare sites. So for the NHS Forest, our 2 key objectives at the moment are improving biodiversity on the NHS Green Estate through firstly ensuring that the NHS Green Estate is visible, valued and integrated as part of local green infrastructure, and facilitating nature positive approaches by the NHS. And secondly, enabling the delivery of nature-based interventions as part of a sustainable healthcare system by demonstrating the value of nature-based interventions for patient treatment and patient recovery, facilitating innovation that enables delivery on the NHS Green Estate and beyond, and providing training and support to those working within the healthcare system to value and incorporate nature-based interventions for improved health and well-being. To do this, and to help the healthcare sector utilise its potential of its green estate to meet the goals of COP, we're making sure that we tailor our communications and advocacy work to all sectors of the NHS, from encouraging occupational therapists to use green walking in their clinical practice for mental health recovery, to assessing natural capital value of NHS trees and woodlands to advocate for their value at a board and finance director level. We're developing training for clinicians, finance managers, sustainability office and estates staff so they can work across departments to understand and use their green estate better as a healthcare asset with thriving biodiversity. Our tree planting programme is expanding, and with it we've got increased capacity for producing woodland management and tree management plans and tailoring bespoke advice to sites looking to create woodlands that benefit biodiversity, but also provide health-giving spaces for staff, patients and the wider community. So the healthcare sector has a huge potential role to play in meeting the goals of COP. The NHS is an anchor institution. It has a responsibility not just to its staff and patients, but also to the wider community around each of its sites. And it can contribute to nature recovery on a landscape level through increased partnership working and a consideration of how healthcare settings could become somewhere that people not only go when they're sick, but also visit to improve their mental and physical health when they're well. And a thriving NHS green estate can improve population health and contribute to nature recovery. And the NHS Forest is here to help them achieve this. Thank you.
Great, thanks Miriam. That's a really good whistle-stop tour in terms of what CSH is doing at the moment. and with such a track record, clearly, you know, there's still a lot more to do though. You're talking about improvements to population health, and I suppose one of the questions I've got in my head is actually around what, you know, there is a green estate there already, and there's further work that could be done. But where do you see, you know, where do you see the greatest opportunities within the NHS estate for further enhancements that will have a positive impact, you know, for patients, staff, visitors, or others that might access the space from outside of the hospital environment?
Yeah, so each of those kind of categories of people definitely have different needs, and I think that improving the green estate and improving how it's managed and accessed and used can kind of speak to all of them. So for staff, having a green space to take a break during a busy working day or relaxing before or after a shift can be a really invaluable way to improve well-being and reduce work-related stress. So that's a problem that costs the NHS millions of pounds a year in staff absences, and improving staff well-being is really important for then kind of improving the efficiency of the NHS itself. For patients, having a quiet or natural area to reflect away from the busy hospital environment can improve mental health, and having areas of hospital grounds that are also actually used in therapeutic activity, so dementia therapy gardens, physiotherapy in the outdoors, and mental health recovery walking routes. These can be a really strong alternative or complement to ward-based treatments. And then for the wider community, again, that kind of concept of the NHS as an anchor institution with a responsibility to broader public health outcomes, making green spaces on NHS grounds accessible can increase the amount of green space in a local area. So this provides opportunities for the wider community to recreate and connect with nature. And it also has this really strong potential to improve equity and access to green space. So in areas where there's lower than average quantities or quality of green space, making the NHS estate accessible and a beautiful place, a kind of thriving green estate for the wider community to enjoy those public health benefits that it brings.
Great. Well, that's quite a comprehensive answer. Thanks, Miriam. I didn't expect anything less from you, to be fair. Before we move on to the last speaker, just wondering, you know, the topic of this is how we take that strategic global commitment back to a local level. And you've mentioned a lot of the grassroots work that you're doing, but do you see, maybe it's a bit of a flippant question, but do you see those strategic priorities being implemented at an NHS level, you know, in terms of moving those commitments from COP15 into the kind of local area before you push that within the programs that you're performing on?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that lots and lots of NHS green plans do discuss improving biodiversity and the quality of their green estate, but we see that the sort of strategic plan of how to do so and the kind of capacity and education is maybe something that hasn't been quite fulfilled, like in terms of its potential. So I think the key priority for us is this sort of cross-sectoral education across all members of the NHS staff workforce, that the green estate can be a healthcare asset rather than a cost or a risk. So the next generation of NHS green plans are going to be published in 2025. So for us, the next year and a half is really key to position the green estate strategically to make sure that people are using the resources out there that are available to them, but also that we're building that capacity and education across the NHS so that people on the ground are empowered to take on projects that deliver for those goals.
Perfect, thank you. And you're right on time. Thanks, Miriam. So we'll move on to our final speaker of the day before we kind of wrap up with a summary and some Q&A. I'd like to now introduce Andrew Tempany, who's Technical Director and a Chartered Landscape Architect within Stevenson Halliday, which is an RSK Group company. Andrew's been a landscape architect for more than 20 years, specialises in nature-based solutions, green infrastructure and strategic approaches to design for resilience and nature recovery. I can attest that he's an enthusiastic advocate of regenerative design. and place-led design approaches, leading on lots of this work, both with me and others within with our healthcare clients and across the group. Also plays a lead role in developing thought leadership and insight in nature-based solutions, and having been co-author of Nature of the City, Green Infrastructure from the Ground Up with Tom Armour from REBA. So Andrew, no pressure, but last presentation of the day. Good luck.
Thanks, Warren. Hello, everybody. So today I'm going to talk briefly about some of the practicalities associated with design and delivery of some of the objectives and commitments in COP, based on my understanding of some transferable lessons I picked up in my work in green infrastructure and nature-based solutions more generally. Just wait for the slides to advance. Yeah. So here's a very quick overview of what I'm going to cover in the next 6 minutes or so. And really, I'm going to introduce it by talking a little bit about two of the goals and our own work in the space. So goal A, which is all about the integrity and connectivity and resilience of ecosystems and restoring, enhancing and maintaining them. And I think really a lot of this is about landscape-led design thinking or systems or circular thinking as well. So making connections between different areas for multifunctional design and management. Because if we get landscape right in terms of response to place and conserving, enhancing valued landscape characteristics and natural capital assets, so the spatial framework for biodiversity, really we see an example here with the photo of one of the nationally rare black poplars that we introduced at a site as part of a landscape scale wetland creation for visual mitigation and integration of a large piece of infrastructure. This starts to show the idea of landscape and nature as an experience and the creation of opportunities for awe and wonder. And it also comes back to the idea that landscape and its core functions like biodiversity are the setting to every aspect of our lives from beginning to end. Goal B is all about sustainable use and management of biodiversity and valuing, effectively managing and enhancing nature's contribution to people. So people principle is really fundamental, as are the possibilities that landscape and biodiversity and contact with nature have to provide experiences for us, for our physical, mental and metaphysical health. So it's the potential for natural environments to be not just restorative, but also regenerative too. And not just in a green social prescribing context, but in designing for healthy modes of living. So the image on the right shows a concept for a new wetland community park that we're working on in proximity to a large centre of population. So it's providing wild space and equity of access and provision and tranquil spaces for people to enjoy contact with nature in proximity to a large town. So when we start to think a bit about solutions on site, and particularly in a healthcare context, here's the beginnings of a design approach to embed biodiversity through nature-based solutions in healthcare settings. And really, we can think about 5 possible core principles or themes, which I've highlighted on the left, and how these might relate to the various aspects of arrival, use, experience, and operational and estate considerations here in a primary care facility. And of course, many of the ideas that we see on this slide are transferable to all sorts of other design scenarios too, as part of a good design-led and landscape-led design approach. And really, I think these ideas hold whatever type of health environment, and we can transfer the thinking to any type of health project, whether in the extension of a historic Chartist settlement in Gloucestershire with the project that we worked on the left, where we used the kind of historic interest that the Chartists had in life on land, and essentially as cues for permaculture and community growing focused green space to facilitate healthier, kinder communities and healthy modes of living. This, of course, can relate to the middle image too, so therapeutic horticulture, whether that's self-directed or referred through green prescribing intervention. And we certainly see the role that nature and biodiversity can play in awe, wonder and experience in brilliant projects like healthy cityscapes like the one on the right, which is Bosco Verticale by Stefano Bueri. So it's a bioarchitecture solution making measurable contributions to citizen health through filtration of air quality and dust and UV as well through a nature-based architectural intervention. As to the what and the why, I'll just dwell really briefly on the intrinsic value of nature-based approaches to our health and well-being. I'm not going to dwell on this at great length, but since we already know a lot of this, but I think it's worth revisiting a few ideas really briefly. And it's the fact that nature has always been a fundamental part of civilization, where and how, and wherever and whenever we might have lived. So whether we see that in the indigenous wisdom of ancestor civilizations and their innate knowledge of and respect for the planet's systems on the left, early civilizations and landscape-led and nature-led development writ large here in Babylon and Mesopotamia, or our historic life on the land. And of course, we could mention things like the People's Park movement in the UK and the City Beautiful urban planning movement in the US, and perhaps things like the role of parks and green space in providing gardens for the gardeners as part of that. And as William Bird from Intelligent Health has noted, we were designed to be connected to nature. You certainly see this in the depth of our associations with it, for example, in the scenic painting of great 19th century artists like Caspar David Friedrich on the slide here, or the central role that landscape and the natural world provided in plots for authors as diverse and different as Emily Bronte, Thomas Hardy, Bram Stoker, Laurie Lee, and Jack Kerouac. But now, how do we get there? And thinking about how we embed nature-based design interventions and achieving it successfully, I've set out here 5 brief ideas, five principles essentially. And really, it's all about the 5 Ps, as I call them. So preparation, place, people, proximity, and programs. Preparation is absolutely fundamental based on the adage of failing to plan and planning to fail. So it's whether you're thinking about how to get to the end game, how to embed design and biodiverse design through management, maintenance, and governance. So really, it's about thinking about green infrastructure and nature-based interventions as any other form of essential infrastructure and embedding the maintenance of that from the start as we would with any other type of infrastructure. Thinking also about monitoring and evaluation as tools to aid the design process as well as to learn from. And it's also about who you collaborate with and who you'll engage with and how and when. So place and proximity, I think, are very interrelated ideas, and really they're the cornerstones of landscape-led design thinking and nature-based design thinking. So getting away from more esoteric ideas like ecosystem services for a moment, it's about the quality a place has to offer, its potential, the material that you have to work with on site, and making the links to join them up in a multifunctional evidence design. People, so as I mentioned before, the people principle is fundamental. It's thinking about how people use sites and facilities, what they need, what will help them, so particularly in a green and prescribing and treatment context, but also how to educate people as to the benefits of doing things differently and how and when to engage them and how to best collaborate as part of a design, delivery and operations team. So when we put people in place together, we start to think about programming. So the idea of activity to enliven and activate a nature-based design and outcomes and benefits that brings, so to kind of win hearts and minds as well. So just before I finish, there's just some brief examples of some of those ideas in practice, really. So on the right, well, this is an example of a kind of siloed design team, really, but what we're talking about here is true collaboration as the polar opposite of that kind of thing of having people in boxes and compartments. And also the idea really that nature-based design interventions are really a roadmap, and they should be flexible and adaptable to change with time. And finally, as we've seen this image from another project by a landscape-led project by our colleagues at Vinnie's within the group, they should really be rooted firmly in place as well. So that is it. So over to you, Warren.
Excellent, really great way of wrapping that up, Andrew. So just before we bring the rest of the panels in, I suppose as chair, I've got the prerogative of asking a question. In terms of the 5 Ps that you mentioned there, you were talking a lot about people, you talked about implementation, and actually you referred to teams and siloed working. I'm quite interested in trying to understand, and perhaps the delegates would be interested in terms of how do we prevent that siloed working to ensure that you've got really effective, activated green spaces that people can access across the NHS estate.
Okay, thanks, Warren. That's a great question. I think collaboration and listening are really central to that process, and designers really need to be in receive mode at the very beginning of that process. So when they're talking to operational teams who have a balance, a really complex set of priorities and problems, and estates teams as well. So it's all about kind of listening to people's pain points, I guess, rather than trying to impose solutions too early. So I think active listening is really a big part of that kind of collaboration piece to stop silo working. Because really it's about influencing and seeking to guide outcomes as well as opening people's eyes to possibilities, I think, or communicating with them and educating the benefits of different design approaches, or sort of a change in management regime for more biodiverse outcomes, for instance. So that they're really clearly understood, and so that operations and estates teams are fully on board from the beginning. So yeah, I think that's probably the kind of key part of it.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. I really appreciate that, and I'd like to welcome the rest of the panelists to join me on the virtual stage, so that we can deal with some of the questions that have been asked. by the delegates. So if everyone could turn the cameras and microphones on, that would be great. So we've had a number of questions that have come through. Just trying to look at these on the screen now. Here's a question. Given, sorry, there are a number of questions and they're all flooding in now. Let me just see if I can pull that up now. 1 second. So, given the crisis our freshwater and wetlands are facing in the UK and the clear benefits that our blue spaces can provide to well-being and health, is there enough focus on aquatic habitat protection, restoration and creation? Who would like to take that forward?
Yeah, I'll go forward. I'll go first to say no, and then hope someone can back me up with what we could do. So I think on healthcare sector, it's sometimes really difficult. Blue space, that there's the risks of making sure that out the way there's Legionella risk, but also the risk to people going past. So I know at one hospital where they had some open blue space, just a pond, and they had to be separated to make sure that there was no risk of falling in. So I think it's, from a practicality perspective, it's more difficult on healthcare sites. There would be less willingness maybe to do a blue space project compared to a green space project. But where they do exist, I'm not sure what I know it's definitely not part of our guidance about how you can look at aquatic life and that as part of biodiversity. So it probably is a fair challenge. I don't know if the other panelists know projects that have been successful.
Yeah, I mean, everything Ian said is correct. It is a lot more difficult to do blue space projects on NHS sites. There's one site that has come to my mind though, which is Southmead Hospital in Bristol, where they have a really effective sustainable urban drainage solutions project, where they've got, because of the drainage project, they've actually developed these wetland habitats, and the way that on their site that they're kind of located are in areas where people wouldn't kind of accidentally wander into them because they're lower than the rest of the ground. So I think that obviously drainage is a really key priority to deal with, like, our changing climate as well. And I think that would be an opportunity for sites that are looking to improve drainage solutions, but also then could engage with any opportunities there to support biodiversity as well.
Yeah, I mean, and there's obvious. Well, I say there's obvious, but there's a lot of research already that's out there that demonstrates that there are greater sequestration potential from blue infrastructure projects, seagrass and the like, than perhaps in some of the kind of more terrestrial planting programs. Not to say that one is better than the other, it's part of a system, isn't it? But maybe that's another idea for NHS forests at some point in the future. We have spoke a lot about all the positive things that everyone's doing, and the panelists, that's the point of these sessions, is to really kind of transmit that positivity in order to make sure that action's actually put into place. But I suppose one of the questions that's been raised here, and it was a question that I was kind of jotting down, is more around the barriers to entry, or the barriers to ensuring that these kind of global commitments are brought down at a local level. Can maybe, I don't know, Miriam and Catherine, do you see any kind of barriers? What are the barriers in terms of making this happen at a trust level?
A range of barriers. I'm happy to go first. So some of them are, I suppose, relatively well understood in terms of things like cost, people having the capacity. Obviously, there's a lot of focus within the NHS on delivering the best care that can be provided, and that kind of is a really quite intense sort of churn of getting people through the system with the best care as possible. So being able to sort of look away from that and being able to focus on other areas can be quite challenging at times when those targets and speed of what's going on in the NHS is so fast. And I think one that was mentioned a bit as well by Miriam was around the capability side of things. So the skills and knowledge to be able to implement activities in relation to biodiversity within a trust can definitely be a challenge. I mean, there are experts out there that I think trusts can call on if they want to get advice and have people that can help them essentially. So I think that's one way that they can look to try and overcome that particular barrier.
Miriam, would like to come back on that?
Yeah, I agree with everything Catherine said. I think that resourcing and capacity and finance is definitely the main barrier that I encounter on a day-to-day level. The appetite is out there, but the kind of capacity to actually do it tends to be quite limited. I think, just to flip the question around, turn the barriers into an opportunity, actually, I do think there are increasing opportunities kind of going forwards, and as Ian touched on, local nature recovery strategies and the NHS actually being a delivery partner alongside other organisations and Natural England on that landscape level. I think there's really untapped potential for partnership working on the NHS estate. It's not appropriate in every situation, and we do quite a lot of work with secure mental health institutions, for example, where there's a lot more barriers to kind of public participation. But I think for a lot of sites, kind of seeing their site as one part of a broader mosaic of places that have the opportunity to deliver biodiversity and deliver environmental improvement can lead to some really strong partnerships and kind of address that capacity issue. Another barrier I would say is also staff turnover. So what we find a lot is that there'll be someone who's really keen and really engaged and runs like an amazing project, and then they move on to another trust or another job, or they retire, and continuing projects after the individuals move on is, I think, something that's actually kind of consistent across a lot of voluntary or charity sector organisations and an ongoing challenge. So really building in the kind of onus to deliver green space projects into the strategic work and into like plans and getting sign off at board level is really important to make sure that things don't fade away once the individual leaves.
Yeah, actually, it's almost like you read the questions just coming through as you were talking. So it's actually a really good segue, and I'd like Ian to answer this one. And it does link to the question in terms of retention and recruitment and attractiveness of a site and a workplace. So the question, do you believe that a greener NHS estate will be more attractive in recruiting and retention of staff? I suppose that will cover a whole multitude of different folks across the divide, really, not just in terms of sustainability leads, but broader kind of staff across the NHS. But do you have anything you want to come back to on that, Ian?
Yeah, well, I was going to jump in on the last question to say exactly what Miriam said, to be honest, that some of the risks about or the challenges about knowledge and funding and everything is whether you've got someone in a ward or a department who's really keen, and it's one advocate who runs the project, and it's not part of that strategic thing. And I think that's one of the challenges we've definitely got to make sure it's part of a green plan, that it's something that an organisation or a trust or an ICS understands that green space is really key for everything we've talked about, and staff recruitment will certainly be one of those. We had an intern in last year who did a piece of work looking at recruitment to NHS sustainability roles and the state's roles as well, to look at when we have challenges, particularly around wages, that we have very fixed bands for particular roles. So how could you encourage sustainability leads or estates roles to apply for jobs in the NHS rather than in private sector or other public sector? And one of the things she said was about the opportunity, sorry, the intern in the document said about the opportunity that we have in the scale. I think green space is definitely part of that. So if you're going to say, as a waste manager, why don't you work for the NHS rather than work for Veolia or Biffa or your local authority? What is it about the NHS that's really good that would draw you here if the wages are the same or slightly worse? And green space is certainly an opportunity for that. And the volunteering aspects, I think particularly for some estates roles, the more operational. So the working with green space gives you opportunities to work with patient groups or work with communities, so the whole role becomes more interesting, and green space is definitely an enabler for that. but it has, in my opinion, it has to be an enabler that's a strategic aim for the organisation, rather than you got one person who's done a project and they're working really, really hard, but it's not being recognised by the rest of the organisation.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks. And I suppose just as before I get to the Jerry Springer moment and kind of summing up with final thoughts as we approach 12:30, Andrew, I know you've done a lot of work with the likes of Natural England and others in terms of socio-economic benefits of green spaces and nature-based solutions. Is there anything that you wanted to add to Ian's comment there before we wrap up?
Well, yeah, I suppose I think it kind of adds a bit to what both Ian and Miriam have been saying around, I guess, around sort of knowledge share and communicating those benefits really clearly. And that's one of the work that we've found around evaluating nature-based solutions interventions, and how you can kind of qualify and quantify the benefits of those things. And some of those things can be quite impactful, but it's kind of being, I guess, it's sort of mindful of things like scale and time and the way things are managed, and what that might do in terms of variables for additionality of benefits for green space and things like that. But a lot of it, I think it's just about communicating those things really clearly, but also knowledge share and spreading that more widely within the team, so there's resilience for it when people move on. And because that's a staff turnover is a kind of classic problem for lots of green space projects as well, and I think that's a lesson we've learned there as well. But so that's what I'd add to that one.
Right, appreciate that. And I'm sorry to rush everyone just at the end there. We've just got 2 or 3 minutes left, so really appreciate the time that everyone's put into that. I think it's been a worthwhile discussion, and there are a few more questions to answer, which we'll talk about in the post session follow-up. I just want to wrap up with a few comments, which, if I can read my scroll that I've written down during the course of this. But I think in summary, for me personally, it feels like these commitments aren't just these esoteric statements. They are being translated to a local level, and that's been evidenced by the panel with some examples today. Nature is an essential part of our health and well-being, as well as being able to support better health outcomes or access to green and social prescribing. Resources are available, maybe not available to all, but appreciating a lot of those will be predominantly for those working within the NHS with the how-to guides, and nature-based solutions are being implemented to help achieve the more broader goals. But we really mustn't stop there and rest on our laurels, pardon the pun. But there's more to do, and there's definitely more that we can do to act, both to deal with the climate crisis and the inextricably linked biodiversity crisis that we face. So I think that really just leads me to the last couple of points, to thank the panelists once again with a virtual round of applause for everyone. And also I'd like to thank our team behind the scenes as well, Jane, Amri and Danielle, without whom the sessions really wouldn't proceed. There's a lot of work that goes on in the background, so thank you very much to everyone that's made it happen today. Very final comment now, please do fill in the feedback forms in the survey. They'll be sent out within the hour. It helps us in terms of feedback. And the next webinar in our COP15 series on commitments on the 24th of August, we'll be looking at how innovations within the water sector can react to COP15 framework requirements. So we look forward to seeing you at the next session, and thanks once again. Bye-bye.